Welcome to WION Live broadcast from New York City with a co-production with a Voice of America. I'm Susan Tehrani coming to you live from New York City, and we begin with Washington's top diplomat on the move in the Middle East. Hamas says it's reviewing a ceasefire plan in Gaza put forth by Israel. This follows a visit to Israel by an Egyptian delegation where officials describe, quote, a new vision for a prolonged end to hostilities. VOA's Arash Arabsadi has more.
Another night of protests in Tel Aviv as hundreds call for new elections and the ouster of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
I want for elections to be held not in a year or two, but right now, as soon as possible. I want all the hostages back because I can see the government does not want them back.
Protesters say Netanyahu's government isn't doing enough to bring home the hostages, despite him recently having said Israel will increase both political and military pressure on Hamas. Anti-government protests have become more common since the Western-designated terror group Hamas stormed Israel October 7, killing roughly 1,200 people and kidnapping around 250. About 130 remain in captivity. Hamas's military wing released a video over the weekend that appears to show hostages Keith Siegel and Omri Moran sending messages to their families as the Jewish holiday Passover draws to a close at the end of April. The Reuters news agency was not able to independently verify when or where the video was taken. Since the Hamas invasion, Israel's air and ground offensives have killed more than 34,000 Palestinians, according to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. Civilians and some lawmakers on both sides of the conflict continue to call for a brokered peace deal that would see hostages exchanged for an end to hostilities.
The first thing we ask for is a ceasefire, and secondly, we want the humanitarian aid to be able to reach the Palestinian people who are in dire need of it in all of Gaza.
Abbas added that Palestinians would accept no human displacements from Gaza or the West Bank to locations outside of Palestinian territories. Meanwhile, in the Palestinian city of Rafah, an Israeli airstrike over the weekend killed at least 6 people, 4 of them children, according to local health authorities and confirmed by the Associated Press. Rafah's estimated population of 275,000 ballooned to nearly 1.4 million people since the war's start, according to the United Nations. And as the United States continues sending military aid to Israel in a war that has seen the destruction of most civilian infrastructure in Palestinian territories, protests popped up across a number of U.S. colleges and universities. Demonstrators call for solidarity with Palestinians and an end to U.S. support for Israel. Police arrested hundreds while universities suspended or expelled students. News of those protests traveled to Gaza, where displaced people living in tent cities spray-painted messages of thanks for support they received from half a world away. A recent foreign spending package out of Washington would see more than $9 billion in humanitarian aid for Gaza. An Egyptian delegation recently met with Israeli leaders to help broker a peace deal. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that Egypt's proposal, if accepted, would see at least 3 weeks of ceasefire and an effort to stop an Israeli ground offensive in Rafah. Arash Arabsadi, VOA News.
For more on this, we are being joined by Jessica Stone. She's live with us with additional reporting. She's a VOA correspondent from the White House. Jessica, good to see you. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in the region this week pushing for a ceasefire. How are those efforts going?
Well, during his time in the region, Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling Hamas responsible for, quote, standing in the way of a ceasefire. And as Arash Arabsadi reported, they are still negotiating over a ceasefire deal. They have the Hamas has initially said no to the initial offers this week, but negotiations are still ongoing. And fundamentally, here is the question: will Hamas accept a deal to exchange hostages for a temporary but long truce as opposed to a permanent end to hostilities, which is what it says it wants, or and will Israel accept the delay of a planned invasion into Rafah, which we know has a lot of the refugees, more than 1 million of the refugees that have moved from other parts of the country. That would not allow Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, to claim absolute victory, that he had absolutely destroyed Hamas if he decides not to go into Rafah. So the current state of play is basically that there needs to be some significant concessions on both sides, and the Associated Press is reporting in the latest iteration of these negotiations that is taking place, because Antony Blinken was very clear in the region this week that the time is now, that there need to be significant concessions on both sides to reach a deal. And both the U.S. and Egypt do not want Bibi Netanyahu to send those troops into Rafah, arguing that it would be too dangerous to all of those refugees that are there, and potentially send them spilling over the borders into other neighboring countries, including Egypt. Susan?
Israel has also called for the return of some 100 hostages believed to be held by Hamas. What is Antony Blinken's message to them and their families?
Well, he did speak to them. There were several protests right outside some of the venues that he was doing meetings at, particularly in Tel Aviv. He told them, quote, "Bringing your loved ones home is at the center of everything we're doing here with respect to the peace talks." Hamas, as you said, still believed to have at least 100 hostages in its possession, also the remains of at least another 30 others. And remember, the numbers at the October 7th attack, that was 1,200 Israelis killed, 250 captured. So still a balance of at least half, roughly, of the hostages still not being returned to their families. And Israeli negotiators have said they have lowered the number of hostages they're asking to be returned in exchange for some of these negotiations. Israel's counteroffensive, meantime, against Gaza has killed more than 34,000 people, about 2/3 of them women and children, according to the health ministry in Gaza. And Israel says the death toll does include several thousand Hamas militants. Susan?
Jessica, please do stay with me. I'd love to get your thoughts on our next story about the upcoming U.S. presidential election, where a majority of younger U.S. voters wish they could choose someone other than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Some of that has to do with the age factor. But who are the younger voters backing one of these two? VOA correspondent Scott Stearns has the story for us.
In a race between the two oldest presumptive major party nominees to run for president, there are questions in this campaign about the candidate's fitness for office, especially from younger voters. Desmond Kager would like a different choice.
Republicans or Democrats can, put someone on the ticket that actually is, worth voting for, then I'll vote for them.
A Pew Research survey last week found that 2/3 of voters under age 30 would replace both candidates if they had the chance. So who are the young people backing Biden or Trump? Concerns about reproductive rights means Biden has the support of Francesca Paniello.
I think abortion is important to me, abortion care, the right to be able to choose.
Abortion rights and recreational marijuana are both on the Florida ballot this November. That's bringing out younger voters for Democratic causes, says Jaden D'Onofrio.
Youth voters have a real opportunity to shape the electoral landscape here in Florida. We've seen that the right to choice and recreational marijuana are critical to the beliefs and importance of youth voters and what's top of mind for them, especially with the right to choice.
Some young people oppose Biden for his support for Israel in the war in Gaza, but that's likely to earn him the vote of Eliana Stein.
I feel like right now, for me, one of the most important things is continued support for Israel, especially throughout this conflict that's going on. So I really appreciate everything that President Biden has been doing to support the country of Israel in this current conflict.
Young people supporting Trump include Wisconsin voters Brianna Bonilla and Jonathan Boyer.
I mean, I've tried to have conversations with people who don't like Trump, and they're like, you can leave. I don't want to talk to you more. So I think that's the main problem. People aren't open to listening. They're just like, if you like Trump, you're a horrible person, or just that. So I feel like,
yeah, there's never any open discussion.
I feel like
really.
if you're able to have an open discussion, I feel like a lot of people make it say, you know, they just come off like you can't say anything, or they won't talk to you, or they'll tell everyone, and you know, so.
Young Trump supporters are accustomed to people their age questioning their political choices, says Isaiah Turner.
Like, I'll go to the bars wearing a Trump 2024 hat, and I get weird looks like crazy all around for people, but I don't really, it doesn't bother me.
Turner says he admires Trump's stance against corruption.
I think that in the world, America especially, I think there is a ton of corruption. And I think that there's a lot of very scandalous things that is going on all over the world. And I think Trump is one of the only men that has actually had the balls on him, so to say, to call out these people and not be afraid of them. I just feel like he's going to do what's best for the country, you know?
A Reuters Ipsos poll in March showed Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 favor Biden over Trump by 3 percentage points. That's a far smaller margin than the 24% gap that Biden won the youth vote with 4 years ago. Scott Stearns, VOA News.
Begrudgingly. Let's cross over to VOA's Jessica Stone once again for additional reporting. Jessica, one of the political issues motivating young voters is the conflict in Gaza. This week, we've seen pro-Palestinian protesters across the country on college campuses, and even the occupation of some buildings at these schools. How is the White House responding?
Yeah, it took a while for the White House to issue a response, and it didn't happen in a planned event. It happened on Thursday when Biden made some first public remarks since the escalation of these incidents across college campuses from New York City, as you well know, down the street at Columbia University, and also in Los Angeles at UCLA. What he said is this. He said he supports the right to protest, but he does not support, and neither does the Constitution, the escalation of those protests into violence. He condemned anti-Semitism and making Jewish students on these campuses feel unsafe. He condemned vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, and occupying buildings, all of which has happened on the Columbia University campus, and also condemned the forced cancellation of classes and graduation, which is also happening at some of these campuses. We know that the New York police did clear Columbia and the Hamilton Hall earlier this week, and that there were shots fired, and that's currently being investigated. That police officer who allegedly did release some bullets from his gun is being investigated for that incident. Biden says, though, that he does not support additional law enforcement, such as the National Guard, coming to these campuses. We have seen that as a tactic in past student protests, particularly in the 1960s. And Biden also says, most importantly, perhaps for the protesters who are asking him to reconsider his policy in the Middle East, that he will not.
And Jessica, a common demand for these protesters is a call for the universities to divest from Israel. What does divestment refer to, and how are universities responding?
Yeah, so the definition really varies from campus to campus according to what protesters are asking for, but it essentially comes down to this. Many of these are private universities. They have endowments from family foundations and legacy students that they invest to fund the school as they continue to spend down that money. And what these students are asking them to do is to take those investments out of any funds that relate to Israel with respect to companies doing business in Israel, companies with ties to Israel, weapons manufacturers. And this is really complicated because many of these funds have a number of companies in them. And we know that a majority of modern day technology companies in particular do business and have offices in places like Israel, which also has its own technology sector. So think companies like Alphabet, Google's parent company, and Microsoft. They all have business in Israel. So it can be really difficult for these universities and their donor relations people to sort of unwind all of this adequately to be able to divest. So that's a demand that's being made to them. In terms of university reaction, we did see Brown University. They got a very specific request from protesters to divest from 11 funds or 11 companies, and they are working on that. They plan to vote on that in October. Columbia University, though, has said, their president has said they will not divest from any Israeli-related companies or funds. And so that discussion keeps going on. It's also not really clear that divestment does actually create action. It certainly brings attention, according to analysts, to the companies and to the efforts of those companies. But in terms of getting Joe Biden, the president of the United States, to change policy in the Middle East, we already know from his own words on Thursday that he's not looking to do that anytime soon. Susan?
Yeah, well, Jessica, thank you so much for all of that. And I found it very interesting that at Rutgers, administrators were coming to terms with some of the demands of these protesters as well. Have a great weekend, Jessica, and it's always great talking to you.
You bet. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.